A billionaire saves a badly injured boy, but terror strikes when the boy whispers in his ear. The cold bit through Jonathan Carter's tailored overcoat as he stepped out of the high-rise. The muffled din of New York City, honking taxis, distant chatter, the rumble of subway trains pressed in on him, yet he barely noticed. His polished loafers clicked against the pavement, his mind already cataloguing the next call, the next deal, the next obligation. Another day, another victory. Or so it should have felt. Yet, there it was again, that hollow ache deep in his chest. It stirred as he adjusted his scarf, like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Success had a way of demanding more, and though Jonathan had built his empire brick by meticulous brick, it felt smaller now. It had felt that way since the day they buried Henry. He quickened his pace, brushing past the endless stream of faces that filled the sidewalk. His assistant had texted him about another meeting, another contract to sign. He ought to be invigorated. Instead, his steps faltered as a flicker of movement caught his eye. A crumpled shape huddled against a grimy storefront, half hidden by the shadows cast by the towering buildings. Jonathan slowed, frowning. It was a boy, no older than 12. His dark hair slicked against his feverish brow. The child's clothes hung from him, torn and dirtied, his sneakers worn to the soles. He was shaking, though whether from cold or something worse, Jonathan couldn't tell. For a moment, Jonathan's gaze drifted away. He wasn't the only one who had noticed the boy. Dozens of people walked past, glancing but not stopping. Some quickened their pace, others turned their heads entirely. A city of motion, indifferent and relentless. The boy stirred weakly, his thin arms wrapping around his knees as he coughed. It was a brittle sound, one that scraped the air between them. Jonathan felt the pull of obligation and guilt, strong enough to tether his feet to the pavement, but not enough to draw him closer. Not yet. A voice rose in his mind, sharp and accusing. You can help him. It's a small thing. But the other voice, quieter and colder, murmured back, He's not your problem. He was about to step away when the boy's lips moved. The words were faint, almost swallowed by the wind. Jonathan leaned closer, catching fragments. My sister. Don't let her. Sophia. Jonathan froze. The boy's voice, though weak, trembled with desperation, a kind of fear Jonathan hadn't heard in years. His stomach knotted as images of Henry flashed unbidden, the hospital bed, the wires, the monitors. The last time his son had called for him with the same fragile, pleading voice. Kneeling beside the boy, Jonathan pushed aside the memories. Hey, he said, his voice unsteady. Can you hear me? The boy's eyes flickered open, dark and glassy, darting toward Jonathan before his head lolled to the side. Up close, the boy's frailty was startling. His cheeks were sunken, his skin tinged with a sickly pallor. Hey, Jonathan said again, more firmly this time. What's your name? The boy didn't respond, his lips barely moving. Jonathan caught a faint, broken whisper. Ethan. Sullivan. Jonathan hesitated. He wasn't a stranger to the city's harsher realities, but this felt different. This boy isn't just another case. He's a child, a voice inside him insisted. Jonathan pulled out his phone, dialing his driver. Get the car here. Now, he ordered, his tone clipped but urgent. As he tucked his phone away, he removed his scarf, wrapping it gently around Ethan's thin shoulders. The boy's shivering lessened slightly, though he didn't stir. Hold on, Ethan, Jonathan murmured, unsure if the boy could even hear him. We'll get you somewhere safe. The seconds stretched unbearably as Jonathan knelt there, shielding Ethan from the curious glances of passers-by. Each glance stung, a reminder of how easily the world overlooked its most vulnerable. When the sleek black car pulled up, Jonathan didn't hesitate. Gathering Ethan's frail form into his arms, he carried him to the car, ignoring the prickle of judgment from strangers. Ethan's head lolled against Jonathan's chest, his breath shallow and ragged. "Take us to St. Mary's," Jonathan barked at the driver as he climbed into the back seat. The car sped off, merging into the chaos of traffic. Jonathan stared down at the boy in his arms, his chest tightening. It wasn't just Ethan's frailty that unnerved him. It was the faint whisper of guilt that accompanied it. Guilt for every moment he'd spent building a life that now seemed so hollow. Guilt for every person he'd walked past without seeing. As the city blurred by outside the window, Jonathan's grip on Ethan tightened. He didn't know why he'd stopped for this boy, or why the mention of Sophia had pierced him so deeply. But he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away now. The antiseptic tang of the hospital clawed at Jonathan Carter's senses as he sat beside Ethan's bed, his posture tense and unfamiliar. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors filled the air, steady and relentless, much like the memories he couldn't escape. Ethan lay motionless, his thin frame barely making an impression on the crisp, white sheets. His breaths came shallow, his chest rising and falling, with an effort that seemed to pull Jonathan deeper into his thoughts. The boy's face was pale, his lips tinged with a faint blue, a stark reminder of fragility that clawed at Jonathan's carefully constructed walls. The room was painfully familiar. It wasn't this hospital, no. But the light, the sounds, the weight of helplessness, all brought him back to those months with Henry. He closed his eyes and saw it again. The sterile glow of overhead lights, his son's hand limp in his, the cruel certainty of finality in the doctor's voice. "Mr. Carter?" The nurse's voice snapped him back. He turned, his face impassive, though his voice betrayed the exhaustion that had started to settle. "Yes? His vitals are stable for now. The doctor will run further tests, but he's extremely malnourished. The fever's likely masking other conditions. We'll know more soon." Jonathan nodded curtly, his throat tightening as the nurse left the room. He looked back at Ethan, focusing on the boy's hands, small and dirt-streaked, curled loosely over the hospital blanket. The boy stirred faintly, murmuring. Jonathan leaned closer, his pulse quickening as he caught the ragged whisper of Ethan's voice. "Sophia, don't let them. She's just a kid." Sophia. Jonathan's jaw tightened. The name had echoed in his mind since that first plea on the sidewalk. The way Ethan's voice cracked when he said it, laced with fear and urgency, reminded Jonathan too much of Henry in those last days. His eyes dropped to Ethan's trembling fingers. "Sophia," he repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the name. "She's your sister." Ethan stirred again, his head rolling to one side. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, Jonathan thought the boy might wake, but the fever held him in its grip. His voice, weak and fragmented, carried snippets of a story Jonathan was beginning to piece together. Jonathan's hand clenched the armrest of his chair. "Who left you?" He wanted to ask, but he knew there'd be no answer now. His mind churned over what little Ethan had said, connecting it to the child's gaunt cheeks and bruised arms. The orphanage. What had the boy endured there? He leaned back in the chair, the stiff cushions doing nothing to ease the tension gripping his shoulders. His eyes flicked to the wall-mounted television, muted but flashing images of a financial news program. Headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen: mergers, markets, another empire rising. It should have drawn him in, but it felt irrelevant now. What does it all mean anyway? He had asked himself that more and more lately. Ethan's unconscious form in the bed beside him made the answer feel sharper than ever. Not much. His thoughts wavered, carried back to the room he hadn't entered in years, the nursery-turned-hospital room in his sprawling penthouse. Henry's favorite car toys still sat abandoned on the shelf. Jonathan hadn't had the heart to clear them away. He could see Margaret standing in the doorway, her face tired and pale, her voice trembling, when she asked, "How much longer, Jonathan? How much longer do we wait for a miracle that won't come?" He'd wanted to argue, to tell her they had to keep trying. But her eyes had already said what he refused to. They'd lost Henry long before his heart had stopped. A sharp cough from Ethan broke through the memory. Jonathan shot up, his hand instinctively reaching for the nurse call button, before the coughing subsided into strained breaths. "I'm here," he said softly, though he wasn't sure the boy could hear him. For a moment, Ethan's face softened, his lips barely parting as he whispered one more time, "Sophia." Jonathan sat back down, his chest tightening. The boy was fighting, clinging to a sense of purpose even in his fevered haze. Protecting Sophia wasn't just a goal, it was his reason for holding on. The realization stirred something deep in Jonathan, a flicker of the determination he thought he'd buried with Henry. He stood, pacing toward the window. Outside, the city moved relentlessly on. Cars blurred past, horns blaring, pedestrians surging forward in unison. Jonathan's reflection in the glass stared back at him, hollow-eyed and distant. "I won't fail you," he murmured. As the first rays of dawn began to seep through the cracks of the city skyline, Jonathan turned back to the boy. He reached for the chair and sat once more, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took this time, he wouldn't look away. Jonathan stood in the dim hospital corridor, the cold sterility of the walls around him pressing down like an invisible weight. Outside Ethan's room, the steady beep of monitors punctuated the silence, a sound that clawed at his chest and pulled him unwillingly into the recesses of his memory. It was another hospital, another boy, another fight he couldn't win. Henry had been 8 when they first noticed something was wrong. It started with small things, fatigue after playing, a cough that wouldn't go away. Jonathan had brushed it off at first. "He's just tired," he told Margaret. "Kids get sick all the time." But Margaret hadn't been convinced. She pressed for answers, and Jonathan grudgingly agreed to take Henry for tests. He still remembered the doctor's office, the sterile smell of disinfectant mingling with the muted chatter of patients in the waiting room. Henry sat beside him, clutching a small toy car, a blue one with peeling paint. The doctor entered with a folder pressed tightly to her chest, her face too composed. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she began, her voice gentle, careful. "There's something in the scans we need to discuss." Jonathan barely remembered the rest, something about Henry's heart, a defect that had gone undetected until now. A rare condition. Serious, but treatable, she said. Yet her words didn't stop the icy hand that gripped Jonathan's insides, the growing certainty that life as he knew it was slipping through his fingers. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, consultations and surgeries. Henry's room at home became a makeshift recovery suite, filled with machines that beeped and whirred, monitoring his every heartbeat. Jonathan threw himself into work, convinced that more money, more influence, could buy the answers they needed. He called in favors, hired the best specialists, flew them in on private jets. But nothing changed the fact that Henry's little body was losing its fight. Margaret was always at Henry's side, reading to him, feeding him, holding his hand through every procedure. Jonathan tried to be there too, but his presence always felt clumsy, out of place. He wanted to fix things, not watch helplessly as his son grew paler with each passing day. The worst moments came at night. The house would fall silent, and Jonathan would sit alone in his study, a glass of scotch in hand, staring at the photograph on his desk. It was from Henry's 6th birthday, a picture of the 3 of them at the park. Henry's grin was wide and unrestrained, his hands covered in cake frosting. Margaret was laughing, her arm around Jonathan, who wore an awkward but genuine smile. It felt like a different lifetime. Then came the final week. Henry had been admitted to the hospital after another collapse. This time, the doctors were less optimistic. "He's very weak," one of them said, their words like nails driving into Jonathan's chest. "We'll do everything we can." But... That word haunted Jonathan. He stayed at the hospital that night, pacing the corridor outside Henry's room. Margaret was inside, reading softly from Goodnight Moon, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Jonathan didn't go in. He couldn't bear to see Henry so fragile, so unlike the boy who had once raced toy cars across the living room floor with boundless energy. It was Margaret who finally pulled him in the next morning. "He's asking for you," she said, her voice hoarse. "You need to be there." Jonathan stepped into the room, his chest tightening at the sight of his son. Henry's face was gaunt, his eyes too big for his small frame. But when he saw Jonathan, he managed a faint smile. "Hi, Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jonathan sat by the bed, his hand enveloping Henry's frail one. "Hey, buddy," he said, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling?" Henry didn't answer. Instead, he looked up at Jonathan, his gaze piercing. "Are you scared?" The question hit Jonathan like a blow. He wanted to lie, to tell Henry everything would be okay, but he couldn't. Instead, he squeezed Henry's hand. "A little," he admitted, "but I'm here. I won't leave you." Henry nodded, closing his eyes for a moment. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to be scared. I'm not." Jonathan couldn't stop the tears that welled up then, spilling over, as he leaned down and pressed his forehead to Henry's. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "So proud." When the machines finally fell silent, it was Margaret who collapsed into tears, her sobs echoing through the sterile room. Jonathan stood frozen, his hand still clutching Henry's, unable to let go. The weight of his failure pressed down on him like an iron shroud. He had promised to protect Henry, to give him a future. And he had failed. Now, standing outside Ethan's hospital room, Jonathan clenched his fists, the memory burning fresh in his mind. Ethan's pale face, the way his chest struggled to rise and fall, it was all too familiar. But this time, Jonathan told himself, it would be different. "I won't fail him," he murmured under his breath, his voice hard with determination. "Not this time." The beeping of the monitors continued, steady and relentless, a reminder of the fight ahead. Jonathan stepped forward, the weight of his past still heavy on his shoulders, but his resolve unshaken. Whatever it took, he would not let history repeat itself. The first thing Ethan noticed when his eyes fluttered open was the hum of fluorescent lights. His body felt leaden, his throat parched. He blinked slowly, struggling to focus on the sterile white ceiling above him. His breaths were shallow, rasping in the quiet room. A man's voice broke the silence. "Ethan, can you hear me?" Ethan's gaze drifted toward the source. The man sat in a stiff-backed chair, his expression etched with concern that didn't quite match the sharp lines of his suit. Ethan squinted, trying to remember where he had seen him before. The sidewalk, the cold, and then nothing. "My sister," Ethan croaked, his voice barely audible. Panic laced his words, his mind clawing through the fog. "Sophia, I need to go back." Jonathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He spoke calmly, though the weight of Ethan's desperation pressed on him. "You're safe here. Just rest for now." Ethan shook his head weakly. "They'll hurt her. like they did the others. Who will? Jonathan pressed gently, his tone firm but not unkind. Ethan's eyes filled with tears that spilled over as he muttered, "The people at the home, they don't care. They locked us in. They let the sick kids die." His voice cracked, and he turned his face toward the wall, the effort of speaking draining what little energy he had. Jonathan sat back, his chest tightening. The fragmented words painted a grim picture he couldn't ignore. He watched Ethan's trembling frame and felt a pang of guilt for every time he had ignored stories like this in the news, for assuming the system would take care of it. For Henry. "Ethan," he said softly. "Sophia, your sister. Is she still there?" A faint nod. "She's only 6. She can't survive there." The boy's shoulders shook as he stifled a sob. Jonathan hesitated, then rested a hand on the bed's railing. He wanted to promise the boy everything would be fine, but the words felt hollow. He didn't know if they'd find Sophia, much less save her from whatever horrors Ethan had fled. Still, he couldn't walk away now. "I'll help her," Jonathan said finally, his voice steady. "We'll get her out." Ethan didn't respond, but his trembling eased slightly. Later that evening, Jonathan sat in his penthouse living room. The lights dimmed to a faint glow. The city skyline stretched out before him, a glittering maze of skyscrapers. He nursed a drink, though it remained untouched on the table. His thoughts lingered on Ethan, his broken words echoing in the quiet. "Jonathan." Margaret's voice cut through the stillness. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. She was dressed casually, but her posture was anything but relaxed. "You missed dinner," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Again." Jonathan exhaled. "It's been a long day." "Because of the boy?" Margaret stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "I've been patient, but this obsession, it's becoming unhealthy." "It's not an obsession," Jonathan said, though even he wasn't convinced. "The boy needs help." Margaret sighed, her frustration surfacing. "And what about us? You've thrown yourself into this without a second thought. Do you even realize how distant you've been?" He stood, his movements deliberate as he faced her. "Margaret, this isn't about us. This boy, Ethan, he's been through hell. He's fighting for his sister's life. And what about our lives?" Margaret's voice rose slightly. "We've been fighting too, Jonathan. But you can't seem to see it. You're always trying to save someone else while we—" She trailed off, her voice trembling. "We've been drowning since Henry." Her words struck deep, the rawness in her tone pulling at something he had tried to bury. Jonathan looked away, his jaw tightening. "This isn't the same, isn't it?" Margaret stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "You're trying to fix what happened to Henry by saving this boy. But Jonathan, no matter how much you do for him, it won't bring our son back." Jonathan's throat worked as he struggled for a response. "I know that," he said finally, his voice low. "But if I walk away now, I'll fail Ethan like I failed Henry." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Margaret stared at him for a moment longer before shaking her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know how much more I can do this," she whispered, before leaving the room. Jonathan sank into his chair, his gaze returning to the skyline. Her words lingered, but so did Ethan's. The boy's fragile voice and the plea for his sister intertwined with Margaret's accusations, each pulling him in different directions. Jonathan sat at his expansive desk in the corner office of Carter Global Enterprises, the skyline of Manhattan stretching endlessly behind him. The hum of the office buzzed faintly beyond the thick glass walls, but Jonathan's focus was anchored on the screen in front of him. The boy's voice still echoed in his mind. They let the sick kids die. The orphanage, St. Vincent's Haven in Boston, had a veneer of respectability. Its website boasted cheery photos of smiling children and well-kept facilities. Jonathan clicked through the pages, the professional polish raising his suspicions further. There were too few details, too much focus on donations and charity galas. It was a performance, a front that barely concealed its hollowness. The first red flag came from the financials. St. Vincent's reported a staggering amount of private funding, but lacked detailed expenditure reports. Jonathan leaned closer, his finger tracing the screen. "Where's all that money going?" he muttered under his breath. A few more clicks revealed a tangled web of shell accounts and vague contractor names. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "Elena, get me everything we have on St. Vincent's Haven. Financials, leadership, donor records, anything. And fast." "Yes, Mr. Carter," came her efficient reply. He hung up, already lost in thought. His search was interrupted by the knock of a heavy hand on the door. Jonathan glanced up as William Harris, his longtime friend and business partner, stepped in, his usual confident grin plastered across his face. "Jonathan." "Working late as always," William drawled, crossing the room with casual ease. He dropped into one of the leather chairs opposite Jonathan's desk, his eyes flicking briefly to the screen. "What's got you so serious? Another acquisition?" Jonathan hesitated, his hand hovering over the mouse. William had always been charming, but lately there was something too smooth, too rehearsed about his demeanor. Still, he leaned back in his chair, keeping his tone measured. "I've been looking into St. Vincent's Haven. You ever heard of it?" William's grin faltered, but only for a fraction of a second, so brief Jonathan almost missed it. "The orphanage in Boston, right? What about it?" "I met a boy," Jonathan said, his voice steady, "who came from there. His story doesn't line up with what the orphanage claims to be." William chuckled, leaning forward as though confiding a secret. "John, you've got to be careful. People will say anything to get a handout, especially kids from places like that. It's sad, but it's the reality." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. This boy wasn't asking for money. He was running for his life. William raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully neutral. "You're serious about this?" "I am," Jonathan said, his tone sharpening. "I've seen too many red flags. Missing money, vague donors, no accountability." William leaned back, his grin returning but with a forced edge. "You're chasing shadows, John. Non-profits are messy, especially ones dealing with children. It's not always sinister." Jonathan studied him, the corners of his mind picking apart William's every word, every gesture. "You seem awfully quick to dismiss this." "Because I've seen it before," William said, spreading his hands. "We deal with big numbers, big risks. You know how easy it is to read too much into things." Jonathan let the silence hang, his gaze locked on William's face. Something wasn't adding up. The next day, Jonathan arrived in Boston, his jaw set as the orphanage loomed ahead of him. The cheerful facade was almost offensive in its artifice. A freshly painted sign announced St. Vincent's Haven, a place of hope. But the chipped bricks and barred windows told a different story. Inside, the air was heavy, damp, with the scent of industrial cleaner masking something far less pleasant. A harried woman at the reception desk greeted him, her smile strained. "Can I help you?" Jonathan introduced himself, flashing the business card of his foundation. "I'm considering a partnership with the orphanage. I'd like a tour." Her hesitation was subtle, but telling. "Of course. Let me get someone to show you around." The tour was carefully curated. Jonathan was led through classrooms with bright posters and a common room where a few children played half-heartedly with mismatched toys. But the cracks were evident. The children's clothes were worn thin, their faces hollow. One boy flinched as the guide walked too close. Jonathan stopped in a dim hallway, his eyes landing on a locked door. "What's in there?" The guide shifted uncomfortably. "That's the storage area. Nothing interesting." "May I see it?" "I'm afraid it's off limits," she said, her voice tightening. Jonathan didn't press further, but as the tour ended, he left with a quiet resolve. St. Vincent's Haven wasn't just neglectful, it was hiding something far worse. That evening, back in his hotel room, Jonathan sifted through the files Elena had sent. His pulse quickened as he recognized a name buried in the financial reports: William Harris. His company had donated significant sums to St. Vincent's over the past 3 years, with no explanation of where the funds were directed. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his hands tightening into fists. The pieces were falling into place, and they painted a damning picture. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: William was involved, and it wasn't out of charity. As the city lights flickered outside his window, Jonathan's resolve solidified. The shadows around St. Vincent's weren't just the byproduct of neglect. They were deliberate, and he was going to expose them, no matter what it took. Jonathan sat stiffly in his office chair, the Boston skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. A single file lay open on the desk, pages fanned out like evidence at a trial. The name, Harris Industries, appeared too many times to ignore. William's involvement with St. Vincent's Haven wasn't peripheral. It was pivotal. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Harris is here to see you." Elena's voice crackled. Jonathan straightened, his jaw tightening. "Send him in." The door swung open, and William entered, exuding his usual charm. His tailored suit and easy grin were weapons he wielded with precision. He clapped his hands together. "John, to what do I owe the pleasure? You sounded urgent." Jonathan gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." William's grin faltered for the briefest moment before he complied, easing into the chair with a casual air. "You look serious. Everything all right?" Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His voice was measured, but the edge was unmistakable. "I've been looking into St. Vincent's Haven." William's smile froze, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Still on that, are we? I told you non-profits like that are messy. It's not worth—" "Your company donated over $10 million in the past 3 years, Jonathan interrupted, sliding a document across the desk. "But none of it shows up in their operational records. Care to explain?" William's gaze flicked to the paper, his expression carefully neutral. "Donations are part of the game, John. Tax write-offs, public relations, it's standard practice." "This isn't standard," Jonathan pressed, his voice rising slightly. "This is money disappearing into shell accounts tied to companies you control." William chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "You're reading too much into it. Trust me, these things always look worse on paper." Jonathan slammed his hand on the desk, startling even himself. "Stop lying to me, William. You've been laundering money through that place, haven't you? What are you funding?" William's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, a flicker of irritation breaking through his polished demeanor. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You're walking a dangerous line." Jonathan leaned back, his arms crossed. "Is that a threat?" "Call it advice," William said smoothly, regaining his composure. "You've built an empire, John. Don't throw it away chasing shadows." "I'm not chasing shadows," Jonathan shot back. "I'm chasing answers. And if I find out you've been exploiting those children—" "Exploiting." William's laugh was sharp, almost mocking. "Don't be naive. Do you think those kids matter to anyone else? The world turns a blind eye. At least I'm giving them some value. Jonathan stared at him, his stomach churning. The man sitting across from him wasn't the friend he'd known for years. Or perhaps, he realized bitterly, he'd never truly known him. "You disgust me," Jonathan said quietly. "Get out." William stood, his grin returning, but now laced with menace. "You're in over your head, John. Let it go, or you'll regret it." As the door closed behind him, Jonathan exhaled shakily, his mind racing. William's words confirmed what he already suspected. This went far deeper than financial fraud. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined, and the cost of exposing the truth was growing by the second. That evening, Jonathan returned to his penthouse, the weight of the confrontation pressing heavily on his shoulders. The soft glow of the living room lights greeted him, along with Margaret, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. Her expression was unreadable as she looked up. "You're late," she said, her tone clipped. "I had a meeting," Jonathan replied, loosening his tie. "An important one." Margaret set her glass down with a deliberate clink. "Another meeting, another day where I barely see you." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Margaret, I'm trying to fix something that doesn't involve us," she interrupted sharply, rising to her feet. "Jonathan, do you even see what's happening here? You're pouring yourself into this boy, this investigation, and shutting me out." Jonathan turned to her, frustration flickering in his eyes. "This isn't just about Ethan. It's about something much bigger." "Everything is always bigger with you," Margaret snapped. "Your company, your deals, your crusades. But what about us? What about me?" "I can't just ignore this." Jonathan's voice rose, his composure fraying. "Do you know what I've uncovered? Children being abused, funds being siphoned off. And what about our son?" Margaret's voice broke, her tears spilling over. "You couldn't save him, and now you think saving this boy will make it right." Jonathan froze, her words cutting deeper than he'd expected. "This isn't about Henry," he said quietly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "I couldn't save him, but maybe I can save someone." Margaret shook her head, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. "You're losing yourself, Jonathan, and I don't know how much longer I can stand by and watch." She turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving Jonathan standing alone in the dimly lit room. He stared after her, the silence pressing in like a heavy weight. As the city lights flickered outside the windows, Jonathan sank into the couch, his head in his hands. His personal and professional worlds were unraveling, the threads slipping through his fingers. Yet, amidst the chaos, one thought stood firm. He couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. Jonathan leaned against the hospital wall, the sterile scent mingling with the sharp tang of his own sweat. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and he pulled it out with a glance at the screen. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered, his voice curt. "Carter." The voice on the other end was low and gravelly, distorted slightly as though deliberately masked. "You're digging into things you don't understand." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "That's not important," the voice replied. "What matters is that the girl, Sophia, is in imminent danger. They've moved her out of the orphanage. If you don't act now, she'll disappear." His heart hammered. "Where is she? Tell me where they've taken her." "They're preparing to transfer her tonight. An address will come through shortly," the caller said. Then, with a faint pause, they added, "Be careful. You're being watched." The line went dead. Jonathan stared at the phone, his pulse racing. He didn't have time to process the cryptic warning before a text appeared with an address. It was somewhere on the outskirts of Boston, an industrial area. His fingers hovered over the screen. Who could he trust with this information? Certainly not the authorities. William's reach could easily extend there. Before he could act, the intercom system crackled, drawing his attention. "Code Blue," Room 312, code blue. Ethan's room. Jonathan's stomach dropped. He sprinted down the hall, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The scene inside Ethan's room was chaos. Nurses moved with frantic precision, one calling for epinephrine while another adjusted the boy's oxygen mask. Ethan's small frame convulsed against the bed, his face pale and slick with sweat. Jonathan froze in the doorway, his breath caught in his chest. For a moment, he wasn't in a hospital with Ethan. He was back in the nursery, watching Henry's frail body lose its fight against the machines. "Mr. Carter, you need to step out," a nurse said firmly, breaking through his paralysis. "No," Jonathan said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I'm staying." He stepped into the room, keeping his distance but anchoring himself in the chaos. Ethan's eyes fluttered open briefly, his gaze unfocused. Jonathan moved closer, his voice low and steady. "Ethan, I'm here. Stay with me." The boy's lips moved, the words barely audible. Jonathan leaned in, straining to catch them. "Save me." Jonathan's throat tightened. Ethan's plea wasn't just a request. It was a directive, a command made with what little strength the boy had left. The nurses worked around him, stabilizing Ethan's heartbeat and easing his labored breaths. Finally, the storm subsided, leaving the room in exhausted silence. The attending doctor approached Jonathan, pulling off his gloves with a weary sigh. "He's stable for now, but his condition is deteriorating. We need to get him to surgery soon or—" "Do whatever you have to," Jonathan interrupted, his voice steel-edged. "Money isn't an issue." The doctor nodded, but Jonathan's focus was already back on Ethan, his small chest rising and falling with effort. His phone buzzed again, the address glaring up at him from the screen. The choice before him was unbearable. Stay and ensure Ethan received the care he needed, or act on the lead and save Sophia before she vanished forever. His fists clenched at his sides. The thought of leaving Ethan now, after what he'd just witnessed, felt like a betrayal. But the boy's words echoed in his mind. "Save her." Jonathan leaned over the bed, his voice soft but firm. "Ethan, listen to me. I'm going to find Sophia. You just focus on getting better, all right?" Ethan stirred faintly, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "Promise," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Jonathan swallowed hard. "I promise." He straightened, his resolve solidifying. Turning to the nurse, he barked instructions. "Call my assistant, Elena Carter. She'll arrange anything the hospital needs. Doctors, equipment, specialists. Whatever it takes, just keep him alive." Without waiting for a response, Jonathan strode out of the room, his phone clenched tightly in his hand. The address was burned into his mind as he made his way to the parking garage. Every step felt heavier with the weight of his decision. As the city blurred past the windows of his car, Jonathan's thoughts churned. He was running out of time, caught in a race against forces far darker and more powerful than he'd anticipated. But there was no turning back now. He'd promised Ethan, and for the first time in a long time, Jonathan Carter intended to keep his word. The investigator's office was a dimly lit, cramped space in downtown Boston, crammed with papers, maps, and the stale smell of cheap coffee. Jonathan leaned over the cluttered desk, his eyes scanning the documents his investigator, Paul, had laid out. Each page added weight to the growing storm in his chest. "These are Rachel Sullivan's records," Paul said, tapping on a stack of handwritten notes and typed reports. "She was an accountant before she died, worked for Harris Industries for years." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "She worked for William?" "Not directly," Paul clarified. "She was buried under layers of subsidiaries. But she started noticing discrepancies, funds funneled through shell accounts, payments made to contractors that didn't exist. She tried to raise the alarm." Jonathan picked up one of the notes, Rachel's neat handwriting almost too small to read. She had listed dates, amounts, and names, evidence painstakingly collected, likely at great personal risk. What happened when she tried? Paul's face darkened. She filed an internal complaint. 2 weeks later, her car went off a bridge. Officially, it was ruled an accident, but... He gestured to the pile. Rachel wasn't the only one digging into this. I've found 3 others who tried to speak up. They're all dead. Jonathan's grip tightened on the paper. Rachel's story was beginning to take shape, a woman who had discovered too much and paid the ultimate price. And Sophia? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Paul flipped to another set of documents. Rachel had 2 kids, Ethan and Sophia. After her death, they were sent to St. Vincent's Haven. From what I've pieced together, William used the orphanage as a front for trafficking, laundering money, selling kids to the highest bidder. Sophia was next. Jonathan's chest tightened as he stared at the photo clipped to the corner of the file. It was an old picture of Rachel, smiling with her children in a park. Ethan, smaller and healthier looking, clung to her side. Beside him stood a little girl with curly hair and bright, wide eyes. Sophia. Where is she now? Jonathan asked, his tone sharp. Paul hesitated. The address you received matches a safe house used by William's network. It's where they hold the kids before transport. If she's still there, you don't have much time. Jonathan grabbed the file and turned for the door. Send me everything you have on this. I'll handle the rest. Paul called after him, his voice edged with worry. Be careful, Carter. You're up against people who don't play fair. The safe house loomed like a monolith in the cold Boston night, its cracked brick exterior shrouded in shadows. Jonathan parked his car a block away, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no plan beyond getting inside and finding Sophia. The image of her innocent face in the photo fueled his determination. Slipping through the back alley, he reached the rusted metal door. It was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. He hesitated, his pulse pounding in his ears, before stepping inside. The air was damp and thick, with the stench of mold. The faint hum of fluorescent lights illuminated a series of narrow corridors. Jonathan moved cautiously, his steps muffled by the peeling linoleum floor. He passed empty rooms, their walls scrawled with graffiti and littered with discarded belongings. Then, faintly, he heard it, a soft whimper. He followed the sound to a small room at the end of the hall. Pushing the door open, he froze. On the floor, curled in the corner, was a tiny figure wrapped in a tattered blanket. The girl's dark curls were matted, her body trembling. Jonathan knelt slowly, his voice gentle, but firm. Hey, it's okay. You're safe now. The girl didn't move at first, her eyes squeezed shut. Jonathan reached out, his hand hovering just above her shoulder. Can you tell me your name? She shifted slightly, her voice so faint he barely heard it. Sophia. Jonathan exhaled sharply, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. He wanted to scoop her up and run, but he forced himself to move carefully. Sophia, my name's Jonathan. Your brother Ethan, he sent me to find you. Her eyes flickered open at the mention of Ethan, wide and scared. Ethan? He's safe, Jonathan said, his voice steady. He's waiting for you. Sophia blinked, tears spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, I want to go home. Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. I'll take you home, he promised, but we need to leave now. He wrapped the blanket tightly around her and lifted her into his arms. She clung to him weakly, her small fingers clutching his coat as he carried her through the dim corridors. Every shadow felt like a threat, every creak of the floorboards a potential danger. But he pressed on, his resolve unshakable. As they stepped into the cold night air, Jonathan tightened his grip on the girl. For the first time in years, he felt something close to hope. He had found Sophia, but the fight wasn't over. There were still answers to uncover, and William Harris still had to pay. Jonathan's breath misted in the frigid air as he stepped into the dimly lit expanse of the abandoned warehouse. The steel structure loomed around him, its vast emptiness punctuated only by the faint echo of dripping water and the hum of distant machinery. In his hand, he clutched the thick dossier Cole had compiled, Rachel Sullivan's meticulous evidence neatly organized within. This was his weapon, the truth sharp enough to cut through William Harris's web of lies. William stood near the center of the warehouse, his silhouette framed by a flickering overhead light. He looked calm, too calm, as if he had been expecting Jonathan. His hands were stuffed casually into the pockets of his coat, his stance relaxed. But his eyes, sharp and predatory, betrayed the storm beneath. "John," William said, his voice smooth but laced with mockery, "I thought you'd have the sense to leave this alone." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He strode forward, his steps deliberate, the dossier clutched tightly under his arm. When he stopped a few paces from William, he tossed the file onto a nearby crate. Its contents spilled out: photos, bank statements, transaction records. "Recognize these?" Jonathan's voice was ice. William's eyes flicked to the papers, but didn't linger. His smile widened. "You've been busy." "Rachel Sullivan was murdered because of you," Jonathan said, his voice rising. "Her children were left to rot in that hellhole you called an orphanage. And all for what? To fund your sick trafficking ring." William's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "Careful, John. Throwing around accusations like that can get you into trouble." Jonathan's fists clenched. "I'm not the one who should be worried." William took a step closer, his tone dropping to a low, threatening whisper. "You think waving some papers around changes anything? You're a businessman, John. You know how the world works. Power isn't about what's right. It's about who controls the narrative." Jonathan met his gaze, unflinching. "You don't scare me." William chuckled darkly. "Maybe you should be scared. You've got a lot to lose. Your company, your reputation, your family." The mention of his family sent a surge of anger through Jonathan. "If you so much as touch them—" "Relax," William interrupted, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need for threats. I'm just saying people like you don't win against people like me. You're out of your depth." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice a growl. "You're going to answer for what you've done." William smirked, then turned away, as if the conversation had bored him. "You're a sentimental fool, John. That's always been your weakness." Before Jonathan could respond, the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. William turned back, his expression hardening. "You'd better go now, John. Things might get messy." Jonathan didn't move. His eyes locked onto William's, a silent promise passing between them. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the dossier behind as a warning. At the hospital, the atmosphere was equally tense. Margaret sat in the waiting room, her hands clenched in her lap. The harsh fluorescent lights did little to soften the stark reality of Ethan's condition. The boy was in surgery, his fragile body fighting against odds that seemed insurmountable. Margaret glanced at the empty seat beside her. Jonathan should have been here. She thought back to their last conversation, his unwavering determination to save Sophia, to finish what Rachel Sullivan had started. For the first time in months, she began to understand the depth of his need to act, to atone for his past, to find meaning in his grief. A nurse approached, her expression calm but unreadable. "Mrs. Carter." Margaret stood, her heart pounding. "Yes? The surgery is progressing, but it's touch and go. The doctors are doing everything they can." Margaret nodded, her throat tightening. As the nurse walked away, Margaret sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not just for Ethan, but for Jonathan too. Wherever he was, she hoped he would return safely. Jonathan arrived at the hospital hours later, the weight of the confrontation with William pressing heavily on him. His clothes were damp from the cold night air, his face etched with exhaustion. He found Margaret in the waiting room, her eyes red, but determined. "Margaret," he said softly. She looked up, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Then, to his surprise, she stood and walked toward him. Her arms wrapped around him tightly, and he felt her breath hitch against his shoulder. "You're late," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry," Jonathan murmured, his own voice thick with emotion. "I had to—" "I know," she interrupted, pulling back to meet his eyes. "I understand now. Just promise me you'll come back. For us." Jonathan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. In the operating room, Ethan's heart beat faintly, the machines surrounding him beeping in a rhythm that seemed to mirror Jonathan's own heartbeat. Outside, as the first light of dawn began to break, Jonathan and Margaret sat side by side, their hands clasped together. For the first time in months, they were united, by hope, by fear, by the fragile thread that bound their lives to Ethan's. And in the distance, the battle against William and his empire loomed, a storm yet to come. The faint scent of antiseptic still clung to the air in Ethan's hospital room, though the machines that had once buzzed urgently were now silent. Sunlight poured in through the window, casting a warm glow across the bed where Ethan sat, propped up by pillows. His face, though pale, bore the first hints of returning color. His hand rested loosely in Sophia's smaller one, the two siblings reunited after months of fear and separation. Sophia was perched on the edge of the bed, her eyes wide, with a mixture of relief and wonder. "You're okay now," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded slowly, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. Thanks to him. His gaze shifted to Jonathan, who stood at the foot of the bed, watching the siblings with a quiet intensity. Jonathan's chest tightened at Ethan's words. For the first time, he felt something other than guilt, a small flicker of pride. He had kept his promise. He had brought Sophia back and ensured Ethan lived to see this moment. Sophia climbed off the bed and walked toward Jonathan, her steps hesitant but determined. She looked up at him, her small face serious. "Thank you," she said softly. Jonathan knelt, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now, Sophia. Both of you." The following days passed in a blur of recovery and reflection. Ethan's surgery was declared a success, and while his journey toward full health was far from over, the worst was behind him. Margaret visited the hospital daily, her presence a quiet comfort to both the children and Jonathan. One afternoon, as they sat together in a park near the hospital, Jonathan watched Ethan and Sophia playing on the grass. The sound of their laughter carried on the breeze, mingling with the rustle of leaves. Margaret broke the silence, her voice soft. "You've changed, Jonathan." He turned to her, his brows furrowing. "How do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "You used to measure everything in terms of profit and loss. But now, I see someone who measures his worth differently." Jonathan looked away, his gaze following the children. "They gave me purpose, again," he admitted. "After Henry, I didn't think I could feel that way." Margaret reached out, her hand covering his. "I see it too, and I want to help." Her words were a balm to his weary heart. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope that they might find their way back to each other. A month later, Jonathan stood in the conference room of Carter Global Enterprises, the board of directors seated around the polished table. The air was heavy with tension as Jonathan addressed the room. "I've built this company into one of the most successful in the country," he began, his voice steady but resolute. "But along the way, I lost sight of something important, what it means to truly make a difference." He glanced at the file in his hands, Rachel Sullivan's legacy. "This company has the resources to do more than chase profits. We have the power to create real change, to help those who've been overlooked and silenced." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the boardroom, but Jonathan continued. "I've already started the process of dismantling certain divisions. The funds will be redirected into charitable foundations, focusing on protecting vulnerable children and supporting families like Ethan and Sophia's." The room erupted into protests and questions, but Jonathan's voice rose above the noise. "This isn't negotiable. If any of you have an issue with my decision, I invite you to step down." The stunned silence that followed was all the affirmation he needed. Jonathan nodded and left the room, his steps lighter than they'd been in years. That evening, back at home, Jonathan sat on the balcony with Margaret. The city stretched out before them, its lights twinkling like distant stars. "Do you think this will work?" he asked quietly. Margaret sipped her tea before answering. "I think you're doing the right thing, and sometimes that's enough." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy with unspoken pain, but filled with the possibility of healing. The story ended where it began, with Ethan and Sophia. Jonathan watched as they settled into their new lives, their laughter and joy a testament to resilience. He saw in them the hope he had once thought lost, and he vowed to carry that hope forward, for them, for Rachel, and for himself. As he stood in the park one bright afternoon, watching the children chase each other beneath the golden leaves, Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had faced the darkness, and while it had scarred him, it had also given him clarity. This was his redemption, and it was only the beginning. This chapter closes the narrative with emotional resonance, tying up the characters' arcs while leaving room for the enduring impact of Jonathan's transformation. The tone is hopeful and cathartic, providing a satisfying conclusion that reflects growth, healing, and the power of redemption.